There are words that arrive like a whisper, and there are words that explode inside your chest like a sudden clap of thunder. That night, the silence in the house felt unbearably heavy, almost suffocating, when Evelyn, without meaning to, overheard her own daughter's voice, Clara's, echoing cold and sharp through the phone. "She's dead weight. I can't take care of her right now." For an instant, it was as if the ground vanished beneath her feet. And it wasn't just because of the sentence itself, it was because of the weight of everything it implied. After all, how do you accept that, after years of dedicating yourself to every detail, every sacrifice, someone you raised with so much love could look at you and see nothing more than a burden? But life has a strange way of turning pain into movement. Some people sink, while others decide to swim against the current. And that was exactly what Evelyn did. What she didn't know was that this conversation, so cruel and unexpected, would become the trigger for a radical turning point. A journey of discoveries, improbable encounters, unforeseen challenges, and decisions that would not only change her own life but also the lives of those who once underestimated her. Get ready to walk alongside Evelyn from the night when everything fell apart to the day she realized that, hidden behind the word burden, there was a strength she hadn't even known she possessed. A strength capable of rebuilding, of facing betrayal, of unmasking secrets, of choosing a fresh start, and above all, of proving that it's never too late to write a new chapter even when the people around you still believe they already know how the story ends. It was close to midnight when Evelyn got up to fetch a glass of water. The hallway was bathed in shadows, and the silence in the house was broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. As she passed by the kitchen, she heard Clara's voice speaking on the phone. At first, she didn't think much of it. But it took only a second of attention for the words to pierce her heart like shards of glass. "She's dead weight, I can't take care of her right now." Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs, as if the world around her had shrunk into a single suffocating point. These weren't just words, they were years of love, of sleepless nights, of silent sacrifices, being crushed into a handful of cold, merciless syllables. She pressed her back against the wall, trying to absorb the blow. How was it possible that Clara, the curious-eyed little girl she had once rocked to sleep, singing old lullabies, could now see her as nothing more than a burden? Memories flooded in like waves, birthdays carefully prepared, long hours spent in hospital waiting rooms, clothes washed and ironed late into the night so her daughter would have everything ready the next morning. It was like watching a movie of her own life, but with a bitter, unexpected ending. And at that moment, Evelyn understood that it wasn't just a careless, cruel phrase, it was a mirror reflecting how her daughter truly saw her. The worst part wasn't even the harshness of the words, but the tone of conviction. Clara didn't sound like she was venting in a moment of anger, she was stating a fact she truly believed. Evelyn closed her eyes for a few seconds, trying to convince herself she had misheard, but the words kept echoing, "dead weight." It was an expression she had never imagined hearing from a child. There was something profoundly unjust in being reduced to a burden after decades of being the foundation that held everything together. In the background, the conversation continued. Clara mentioned how overwhelmed she was with work and how she didn't have time to deal with more problems. Evelyn realized, with a tightening in her chest, that she was the problem her daughter was referring to. It was as if her entire life had been turned upside down. The mother, who had always been the one to provide comfort, had now become an inconvenience, something to be managed. And that hurt more than any physical wound could. Suddenly, old memories came back with sharp clarity. She remembered the day Clara fell off her bike and cried for hours, and how she ran to her side, cleaned her scraped knees, and promised that everything would be okay. She remembered the lean Christmases, when she somehow stretched the budget so her daughter never felt the absence of gifts or joy. And now she was seen as dead weight. The cruel irony of this reversal made Evelyn's whole body tremble. She knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. You can't unhear words like those. Something inside her had broken, and there was no way to put the pieces back together in the same way. The silence that filled the kitchen after Clara hung up the phone felt heavier than any argument. It was a silence of distance, of walls being built without anyone realizing it until it was far too late. Evelyn, however, was not just any woman. Despite the throbbing pain, a small seed of thought began to take root. Maybe there was a way for her not to be seen as a burden anymore. Maybe there was a way to reclaim not only her daughter's respect but her own dignity. She didn't yet know how. All she knew was that the first step would be refusing to let that unjust, cruel image define the rest of her life. When she returned to her bedroom, sleep was impossible. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling her heart pound harder than usual. The words echoed, mingled with memories from an entire lifetime. And in the middle of that storm, Evelyn realized that although the night had begun as a devastating blow, it could turn into a turning point. She just didn't know yet that, from then on, every choice she made would shape a future Clara could never have predicted. The hours following that conversation seemed endless. Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, arms wrapped around her knees, while the darkness of the room seemed to blend with the darkness in her thoughts. The memory of Clara's words kept pulsing, and with each repetition, the emotional weight grew heavier. But amid the pain, an idea began to form, hesitant at first, like someone quietly asking permission to exist. What if I simply left? Not as an escape, but as a liberation. She knew that if she stayed, she would always be seen through the same distorted lens as someone to be carried, not as someone who could walk on her own. The death of Charles, her partner for decades, had left a massive void, and Evelyn had already been struggling to rediscover her place in the world. He had always been a protective man, sometimes overly so, and in a way that had contributed to Clara growing up with the idea that her mother was dependent. But Evelyn knew that wasn't the whole truth. She had managed the home, raised her daughter, balanced the bills during hard times, and found solutions when money seemed to vanish into thin air. Still, losing Charles had shaken her deeply, and Clara, perhaps, saw only this fragile phase, ignoring everything that had come before. It was still the middle of the night when Evelyn switched on the small lamp by her bed and opened the drawer, pulling out an envelope with her savings. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a modest new beginning. Next to it sat a pen and a notepad. Without hesitation, she began to write. The words flowed simple and direct. Clara, I need to find my own path. Don't worry. It'll be fine. There was no resentment in the note, only the need to communicate her decision, without leaving room for arguments that might make her back down. Packing was like reliving each chapter of her life. Folding a blouse brought back memories of a trip with Charles. Tucking away an old photograph carried the weight and value of a treasured memory. But this time, there was no room for attachment. The suitcase had to be light not only in physical weight but also in emotional baggage. She took only the essentials: a few clothes, important documents, the envelope of money, and a handful of keepsakes that still gave her strength. When she zipped the suitcase shut, the sound felt like a period at the end of a sentence. The decision was final. She took one last look at the bedroom, at the window overlooking the garden she had tended for so many years. Outside, the night was cold, but there was something liberating in the air. It was as if the wind carried not only the scent of the early morning but also a silent promise that life still had something left for her. Crossing the hallway, she moved quietly. She didn't want a confrontation, not even a glance that might shake her resolve. She passed through the kitchen doorway, the same place where she had heard those cutting words hours earlier, and felt a chill run down her spine. It was like leaving behind a battlefield after losing a war, but this time, the defeat would not be permanent. She knew she had to leave in order to win elsewhere. Outside, the street was almost deserted. Evelyn took a deep breath, pulled her coat tighter to shield herself from the wind, and began to walk. She had no clear destination, only the certainty that she couldn't stay. And while fear lingered, fear of the unknown, fear of loneliness, fear of failure, there was also a spark of excitement. For the first time in a long while, her life wasn't being dictated by anyone but herself. Every step seemed to take her not only physically but emotionally further away from the image Clara had of her. The city still slept, but for Evelyn, the day had already begun. And without realizing it, she had just set out on a journey that would lead her to a place where she would reclaim not only her independence but also the parts of herself she thought she had lost forever. The trip to Harborview was long and quiet, as though each mile traveled gave Evelyn space to reorganize her thoughts. Sitting by the bus window, she watched the landscape change, green fields giving way to tree-lined roads, until the salty scent of the sea and the faint sound of waves began to signal that the ocean was near. Harborview wasn't a famous city, but it had the discreet charm of small coastal towns, where time seemed to move at a gentler, more human pace. When she stepped off at the modest bus station, the cold, damp breeze hit her face, a refreshing contrast to the heaviness of the past days. The town center had cobblestone streets and colorful facades, with shop windows displaying everything from knitted sweaters to maritime antiques. As she wandered aimlessly, her eyes caught the window of a small bookstore, with a hand-painted sign, Harborview Books Tea. On the glass, written in blue marker, was a help wanted notice. Something about the scene, maybe the smell of wood wafting from inside, or the soft reflection of warm lights, made Evelyn push the door open. Inside, the scent of paper mingled with the sweet aroma of cinnamon tea. Behind the counter, a gray-haired man with round-framed glasses looked up from a book and smiled. "Welcome. Can I help you?" he said. Evelyn, a little hesitant, asked about the sign in the window. The man introduced himself as Henry, the bookstore's owner for over 30 years. What began as a brief talk about books soon turned more personal. She explained that she had arrived in town that very morning, that she was looking for a fresh start, and that she had experience organizing spaces and dealing with people. Henry, with a keen, observant gaze, seemed to notice there was more to her story, perhaps someone in need of a safe harbor. "I have a small room upstairs," he offered. "Simple, but comfortable. We can agree on a symbolic rent, and you can help me around the shop." Evelyn hesitated for a moment, but the offer felt like an unexpected gift, and right now, she needed to believe the universe could still hand her something good. The first days were a mix of strangeness and quiet charm. Evelyn woke up early, went downstairs to open the curtains and let the morning light flood in, swept the old wooden floors, and rearranged the shelves, touching each book as if it were a small treasure. She soon discovered that Harborview had a steady flow of both locals and tourists, all curious and somehow more willing to strike up a conversation than people in big cities. Every customer seemed to bring a little story of their own, and without realizing it, Evelyn began reconnecting with the quiet joy of listening and of feeling useful again. The small room upstairs had a window that overlooked the town's central square, where every Saturday a little craft fair took place. At night, the sound of the waves reached her like a soft, constant background music, lulling her to sleep. For the first time since leaving Clara's house, she felt at peace. There were no accusatory voices, no judgmental glances, only a new rhythm, a routine that, though simple, gave her back control over her own days. As weeks passed, Henry began trusting Evelyn with more responsibilities, running the register, organizing book-reading events, and even preparing the tea served to customers. It was through these small tasks that she realized something important: she was building a new life, one that didn't depend on anyone else to validate her worth. Harborview, with its calm streets and the endless whisper of the sea, was becoming more than just a temporary refuge. It was the start of a home. Still, somewhere deep inside, a part of her wondered how Clara would react if she knew where Evelyn was and what she was doing. That question lingered like a distant echo, a reminder that the past hadn't been entirely left behind. But for now, she chose to focus on the present and on the warm feeling she got each time a customer left the shop smiling, carrying not only a book but perhaps a little bit of the new energy Evelyn was learning to cultivate. As the days blended into each other, Evelyn began to notice that Harborview was more than just a place to start over. It was a mirror reflecting parts of herself that had long been buried. While tidying the shelves one afternoon, she found herself watching children who came in with their parents, their eyes lighting up at the sight of colorful book covers. That sight awakened an old memory, the moments when she used to read to Clara as a little girl, curled up on the couch under a blanket, flipping through the pages of a picture book. That memory planted a simple yet powerful idea: to create a special corner in the bookstore dedicated to encouraging children to read. She shared the project with Henry, who responded with a proud smile. "That's exactly what this place needs," he said. In just a few days, Evelyn gathered pillows, bright rugs, and low shelves so the children could reach the books themselves. Hanging a mobile of felt stars and moons above the space gave it the final touch. And so, The Story Corner was born, a small sanctuary inside the bookstore where imagination could run free. The success was immediate. On Saturdays, Evelyn held story sessions for groups of children, alternating between classics like The Secret Garden and newer titles she discovered through customer recommendations. With each page turned, she saw in those little faces the same magic she had once felt when diving into a story. But this time, it wasn't just about the tale itself, it was about connection, about creating memories that might become part of those children's lives forever. Encouraged by the positive response, Evelyn decided to reach even further. She spoke with the local school and proposed a weekly reading program, bringing books and stories to elementary school classes. At first, some teachers doubted whether the children would stay engaged, but after the very first session, everyone saw the impact. Evelyn didn't just read, she performed. She gave each character a different voice, drew the children in with her expressions, and asked questions that made them think beyond the text. With every smile she received and every "When are you coming back, Miss Evelyn?" her heart felt lighter. The life that had once seemed defined by abandonment now had color, sound, and meaning again. The sense of usefulness and belonging grew stronger each day, reinforcing her belief that her independence wasn't just geographical, it was emotional. She wasn't just surviving, she was building something of value. Yet, even in this new phase, Evelyn knew life rarely followed a perfect script. There were days of exhaustion, moments when the ache of missing Clara grew sharper, and flashes when the past came knocking on the door of her memory. But unlike before, she now had the tools to face it. She kept herself busy, surrounded herself with books, and spent her days with people who saw her for what she truly was, a capable, resilient woman with stories worth telling. This reconstruction hadn't happened overnight. It was like restoring an old book page by page, with patience, attention to detail, and care for what still held value. Every step she took in Harborview was also a step further from the pain that had accompanied her when she first arrived. And while there was still much to face, Evelyn began to understand something fundamental. Sometimes, you have to step away in order to find yourself again. And it was in this rhythm between the bookstore, the Story Corner, and the school visits that she began to realize that, without even planning it, she was writing a new narrative for herself. One in which the words burden and dead weight no longer had a place, and where independence and new beginning filled the main chapters. It was a clear morning in Harborview, and Evelyn was at the bookstore, organizing a new shipment of books, when the phone rang. The number on the display was unfamiliar, but she answered with her usual courtesy. On the other end, a hesitant female voice introduced herself. "Evelyn? This is Elaine, Clara's business partner." Evelyn froze for a moment, trying to understand why someone connected to her daughter would be reaching out after such a long silence. The brief pause was broken by a troubled sigh. "I know this is unexpected, but Clara isn't doing well." The words carried a weight of their own. Elaine explained that in recent weeks, the company they co-managed had been facing serious problems, and Clara's personal life was also falling apart. Her marriage to Daniel was hanging by a thread, and there were rumors of poor management and reckless decisions. Evelyn listened quietly, a mix of concern and caution swirling inside her. Part of her instinctively wanted to protect her daughter, as she always had, but another part feared that returning would mean giving up the hard-earned independence she had fought so fiercely to reclaim. As Elaine continued, Evelyn began to realize that the tone of the call wasn't just informative, it was pleading. Clara, apparently, had isolated herself, refusing help and making choices that could permanently damage the company. "I don't know what else to do," Elaine confessed. "I thought maybe if you came, you could help her pull herself together. She listens to you more than she realizes." Hearing those words, Evelyn felt a tightening in her chest. The irony was undeniable. For someone who had once labeled her dead weight, her presence was now being seen as the solution. In the days following that call, Evelyn spent her nights reflecting. She had built a new life, had responsibilities at the bookstore, and ongoing projects that mattered to her. At the same time, she knew that some chances to repair relationships don't come twice. It wasn't only about helping Clara save her business, it was also about deciding whether there might be a path to rebuild something between mother and daughter. She thought back to the stories she read to the children about courage, not the kind with swords and shining armor, but the quiet kind that chooses to do the right thing even when there's no guarantee of a happy ending. Deep down, Evelyn knew that if she didn't try, she would always carry the question of what could have been. The independence she had gained didn't have to mean eternal distance, perhaps it was possible to balance both. The next morning, she told Henry about the call and her possible temporary departure. He listened with understanding and offered his immediate support. "The bookstore will be here when you return. But I think if you feel you should go, you should go. Sometimes, we need to close a chapter, even if it means revisiting old pains." Those words stayed with Evelyn. She began to prepare. She packed a few clothes, set aside a small gift for her daughter, a book Clara had loved as a child, and arranged her bookstore duties so everything would keep running smoothly. She didn't know how she would be received, or if the trip would lead to reconciliation or to deeper wounds. But something inside her told her this was a necessary step not only for Clara, but for herself. That day, as she zipped up her suitcase, Evelyn looked out the small upstairs window and saw the ocean in the distance calm, as if encouraging her. She took a deep breath and thought, maybe this is another page that needs to be written, even if I don't like the opening lines. The trip back felt far longer than the one to Harborview. Evelyn spent hours on the bus, watching the scenery pass like pages of a book she had already read, but now revisited with different eyes. When she finally arrived in the city where Clara lived, she felt her stomach knot. The neighborhood, once vibrant, looked grayer, or perhaps it was only the reflection of what awaited her. She took a taxi to her daughter's house, and when she arrived, she stood for a few seconds at the gate, breathing deeply, bracing herself. The door opened slowly, and Clara appeared. But the woman standing there was not the same one Evelyn remembered. Her hair was messy, dark circles weighed down her eyes, and her slouched posture revealed exhaustion. The inside of the house reflected the same chaos: piles of papers on the table, unwashed dishes in the sink, curtains drawn tight to keep out daylight. Without any formalities, Clara let out a sigh and said, "I don't even know where to start." Evelyn stepped inside, trying to keep the flood of emotions contained. Part of her wanted to run and hug her daughter, another part still carried the sting of those cruel words. But the scene before her made it clear pride would have to wait. "Let's start with the basics," she said firmly, pulling the curtains open to let the light in. Clara just watched, as if she didn't have the strength to protest. As the hours passed, Evelyn began uncovering details Elaine hadn't mentioned. Clara was behind on paying the household bills, company deadlines had been ignored, and Daniel, her husband, hadn't been seen in days. It was as if her life had imploded quietly, without anyone noticing the full extent of the damage. Evelyn felt a deep pang, a mix of compassion and worry. The following days unfolded like a silent, relentless test of patience. Evelyn took it upon herself to restore at least some order to the chaos, starting with small, tangible actions. She organized the piles of papers on the dining table, separating bills from business documents. She ran a load of laundry, scrubbed the kitchen until the counters gleamed again, and made sure there was at least one warm meal each day. Clara, at first, moved through the house like a shadow, speaking little, eating without appetite, and disappearing into her bedroom for hours at a time. Evelyn recognized the signs: the physical exhaustion tangled with the emotional weight, the kind that made even the simplest decisions feel impossible. She didn't press for conversations. Not yet. Sometimes, she would find Clara standing by the window, staring outside without really seeing anything. Evelyn would just place a cup of tea beside her and quietly step away. She knew that trust, once fractured, could not be demanded. It had to be rebuilt, moment by moment. At night, when the house finally grew still, Evelyn would retreat to the small guest room. She would sit on the edge of the bed, the gift for Clara, that childhood book still resting on the nightstand, waiting for the right moment. It wasn't just a book, it was a symbol, a thread connecting them back to simpler days when their relationship wasn't defined by accusations or distance. The turning point came on a Wednesday afternoon. Evelyn was going through a box of unopened mail when Clara walked in, her eyes red-rimmed, holding her phone loosely in her hand. "Daniel left," she said flatly. Evelyn looked up, her hands pausing mid-motion. Clara set the phone down on the table and sat heavily in the chair across from her. He's gone. Packed his things this morning. Didn't even leave a note. For a moment, the air between them felt like glass fragile, ready to shatter. Evelyn wanted to say something, but instead, she simply reached across the table and covered her daughter's hand with her own. Clara didn't pull away. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was something. Over the next few days, the barriers between them began to lower, almost imperceptibly. Clara started joining Evelyn in small tasks, folding laundry, preparing dinner, even sorting through the company's overdue paperwork. Conversations were still cautious, but longer. And one evening, while they were cooking, Clara finally said what Evelyn had been silently waiting for. "I'm sorry for what I said that night." The words were halting, but they carried weight. Evelyn didn't rush to fill the silence, she let them settle, sink in. "I know," she finally replied. "But those words, they don't disappear, Clara. They changed things." Clara nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I was drowning, Mom. And instead of asking for help, I pushed you under with me." It was the closest thing to a confession Evelyn had ever heard from her daughter. And in that moment, she realized that while the wounds might never fully heal, there was room for something new, not the old relationship reborn, but a different one, built with more honesty, even if it was fragile. By the time a month had passed, the house no longer felt suffocating. The curtains stayed open, fresh air moved through the rooms, and Clara's posture had begun to straighten. The company was still in trouble, but with Evelyn's methodical approach and Clara's renewed focus, they had managed to avoid a complete collapse. On the morning Evelyn was scheduled to return to Harborview, she stood in the doorway with her bag, the ocean town calling her back. Clara hugged her, a long, quiet embrace that spoke more than words could. "You know," Clara whispered, "I used to think you needed me. But I think I needed you more." Evelyn smiled faintly, brushing her daughter's hair back from her face. "We both needed each other. We just forgot how to admit it." When she boarded the bus and watched the city fade into the distance, Evelyn didn't feel like she was leaving unfinished business. She felt balanced. She had come not to fix everything, but to offer what she could and to prove to herself that independence and compassion could exist side by side. Back in Harborview, the salty breeze greeted her like an old friend. Henry was waiting outside the bookstore, leaning casually against the doorway. "Welcome home," he said simply. And for the first time in a long while, Evelyn truly believed it. She was home. Not just in a place, but in herself. It was late that afternoon when the inevitable conversation finally happened. Clara, sitting at the table, ran her hands over her face and said, almost in a whisper, "I know I hurt you. I know I said things that were unforgivable, and if I were you, I wouldn't have come back." The sincerity in her voice caught Evelyn by surprise. She remained silent for a few seconds, letting the words linger in the air before answering, "I'm not here to talk about what was said. I'm here to see what we can do from here on." That moment cracked something in the invisible barrier between them. Clara cried, not the dramatic kind of crying that seeks attention, but the quiet tears of someone finally letting the weight fall away. Evelyn, without saying a word, simply placed her hand over her daughter's. There was no need for long speeches. Sometimes reconciliation begins with the simplest of gestures. Even so, Evelyn knew this was only the start of a complicated path. Clara's emotional and physical state was the reflection of much deeper problems in her personal life, her marriage, and her work. And as much as Evelyn's maternal instinct screamed to shield her from everything, she knew that part of this journey had to be her daughter's responsibility. She could be there as support, but she could not carry the entire weight alone. As night fell, Clara made tea and the two of them sat in the living room, wrapped in that comfortable silence only those who share a deep bond can have even after conflict. Evelyn looked at her daughter and thought maybe this is the moment when things start to change. Not because life has become easier, but because we've decided to face it together. 2 days after her arrival, Evelyn received an unexpected visit. Elaine appeared at the door carrying a folder stuffed with documents and wearing an expression that blended concern with urgency. "We need to talk," she said, stepping in without waiting for a formal invitation. They sat at the kitchen table, and Elaine got straight to the point. She had uncovered serious inconsistencies in the company's finances. These weren't just administrative errors, there were unauthorized transfers and personal expenses billed as company costs. As Evelyn listened to the details, she realized the hole was deeper than she had imagined. Elaine, speaking firmly, revealed that Daniel, Clara's husband, had siphoned off about $200,000 over the past year. Some of the money had been transferred to accounts in other states, another portion had been invested in shell companies. Evelyn felt a mix of outrage and an immediate urge to protect her daughter. When confronted, Clara initially denied it, insisting there had to be some mistake. But as Elaine presented bank statements and proof, Clara's expression shifted from disbelief to stunned silence. The room was filled with a heavy quiet, broken only by the distant ticking of the wall clock. Evelyn looked at her daughter, searching for the right words. "This isn't just a financial problem, Clara. It's a betrayal." Clara's face hardened, and she leaned back in her chair as if trying to absorb the blow. He always told me he was handling things so I could focus on the creative side of the business," she murmured. Evelyn knew this was a decisive moment. If Clara let herself be crushed, the company and possibly her reputation would be lost. But if she acted quickly, there was still a chance to reverse the situation. "You have to fight, and I'll be here to help. But you can't let him get away with this," Evelyn said firmly. There was in her tone the same resolve she had used years ago when facing family crises without letting her daughter see the full weight of the difficulties. The hours that followed were spent reviewing each document, highlighting suspicious transfers, and listing witnesses who could confirm the lack of authorization for the expenses. Evelyn, though she had no legal background, organized the information with near meticulous precision, the result of years managing household budgets and small negotiations. Clara, still dazed, began to cooperate, providing passwords, emails, and details of meetings with Daniel that might be relevant. It was during this process that Evelyn realized she wasn't just helping her daughter, she was also giving her back a part of the self-confidence she had lost. Showing that there were paths, strategies, and possibilities sparked a flicker of determination in Clara. "If he thinks he's going to walk away from this easily, he's wrong," Clara said, finally lifting her head with a steadier look. Before Elaine left, Evelyn thanked her for the courage to bring such a difficult truth to light. "I know it's not easy to get involved," she said. Elaine simply replied, "The company is worth it, and so are you." Closing the door, Evelyn felt that despite the gravity of the situation, this could be the turning point not just for saving a business, but for rebuilding trust, and maybe even for Clara to see that her mother's strength went far beyond what she had imagined. That night, sitting at the table with piles of papers, Evelyn thought maybe the greatest victory here won't be financial at all, but showing my daughter that independence and starting over aren't just words, their choices proven through action. The decision to confront Daniel wasn't made impulsively. Evelyn knew that to deal with someone capable of manipulating both numbers and emotions, she needed more than indignation, she needed strategy. She spent the next morning reviewing every document, arranging them in chronological order, as if assembling a puzzle. Clara, still hesitant, agreed to meet him at a discreet cafe downtown, far from curious eyes and, more importantly, away from the emotionally charged atmosphere of the house. Daniel arrived with his usual air of self-confidence, wearing a tailored suit and carrying a smile that might once have seemed charming, but now felt far too rehearsed. Evelyn watched his every move, the way he adjusted his tie, the calculated scan of the room before locking his gaze on them. When he sat down, he spoke first. "I imagine you know why I'm here." His voice was calm, almost provocative. Evelyn, keeping her tone controlled, set the folder on the table and opened it to the first document. "We're aware of the unauthorized transfers and the investments in companies that don't actually exist." The direct mention seemed to knock some of the confidence from Daniel's posture, but he quickly regained it. "Clara, we both know these things happen in business, it was just a matter of cash flow." Clara, who had remained silent until then, took a deep breath and replied, "Cash flow doesn't get funneled into personal accounts, Daniel." The conversation quickly turned into a verbal duel. Daniel tried to shift the subject, bringing up supposed administrative mistakes on Clara's part and hinting that she wasn't capable of running the company alone. That's when Evelyn stepped in, leaning slightly over the table. You can try to change the focus, but numbers don't lie. And we have all of them. Her tone wasn't aggressive, but it was firm, the voice of someone who knew exactly where she stood. Feeling cornered, Daniel sighed and, as if looking for a quick settlement, said, "If this goes to court, we all lose. I can return the money on the condition that none of this goes public." Evelyn could tell that behind his apparent offer of financial reconciliation was real fear, and that fear could be used to their advantage. "We're not here just for the money. We want to make sure there's no room for this kind of behavior in the company or outside of it." The meeting ended with Daniel agreeing to repay the embezzled amount in installments and to sign a formal agreement drafted by a lawyer Elaine recommended. Leaving the cafe, Clara seemed still to be processing everything that had happened. Evelyn, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of relief and caution. She knew such agreements were fragile and that constant vigilance would be needed to avoid future surprises. Above all, though, the moment reinforced something she had begun to realize ever since coming back to help her daughter: when life calls for firmness, you can't wait for someone else to take that stand for you. You have to be your own foundation even when the temptation to retreat is strong. And on that day, Evelyn showed she could be that foundation not just for Clara, but for herself. A few days after the agreement with Daniel, while Evelyn was helping Clara reorganize documents in the living room, Elaine called again, this time with a graver tone in her voice. "I found something you need to hear," she said, asking them to meet in person. Curious and a little apprehensive, mother and daughter went to Elaine's office, where she was already waiting with a flash drive on the table. "These are recordings of old meetings I came across while reviewing the company's audio files. You need to listen to them." The first file began with familiar voices: Clara discussing expansion strategies with other board members. At first, nothing seemed out of place until suddenly Evelyn heard something that made her stomach turn. In a cold, calculated tone, Clara said, "I can't afford to end up dependent like my mother was her whole life. I have to be different." Those words cut through Evelyn like an invisible knife. It wasn't just the memory of being called dead weight, now there was confirmation that her daughter had long carried a distorted view of who she really was. Evelyn remained silent, but Clara noticed the change in her mother's expression. The second audio was even more unsettling: Clara criticizing Evelyn in front of colleagues, implying that she never knew how to handle money and that she lived off her husband. To Evelyn, this wasn't just unfair, it was painful because it revealed that, even outside her presence, her daughter had been nurturing a narrative that diminished her history and her achievements. When the last recording ended, the room was thick with silence. Clara lowered her head, avoiding her mother's eyes. "I said awful things, and at the time, I thought I was being strategic, protecting my image. But now I see I was just repeating fears I made up myself." Evelyn took a deep breath, holding back the urge to react with anger. "It's not just what you said, Clara. It's what you believed about me." The conversation that followed was tense but revealing. Clara admitted that, from a young age, she had feared ending up like the version of her mother she had created in her mind, a woman dependent and without decision-making power. What she had never realized was that this image was distorted, the product of seeing only part of the story, without knowing the whole. Evelyn, in turn, explained that independence isn't just financial, it's also emotional, and that, to achieve it, sometimes you have to let go of old, false ideas. It was a hard dialogue, but a necessary one. Evelyn realized that, although the recorded words still hurt, this could be a starting point for Clara to finally see her mother differently. "I don't expect you to erase what you said, but I do expect you to learn from it," Evelyn said, her voice firm but not hostile. Leaving Elaine's office, the atmosphere between mother and daughter was lighter than Evelyn had expected. Perhaps because, deep down, both knew they had crossed an important threshold into the territory where secrets and old wounds were finally exposed to the light. And like any wound that finally gets fresh air, it hurt, but it was also starting to heal. The next morning, after the revelations, Evelyn woke before sunrise. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, gazing out the window as the sky slowly shifted to shades of gold. She no longer felt the suffocating weight of resentment. In its place was a different clarity, almost serene. She knew the wounds were still there, but she also knew there was now space for them to start healing. Clara, who rarely rose early, came down the stairs and sat across from her mother, still in pajamas. "Can we talk?" she asked, her expression a mix of vulnerability and determination. The conversation began hesitantly, with Clara admitting that the recordings had made her reconsider her behavior not just toward her mother, but toward everyone around her. "I saw myself talking the way my father used to talk to you, as if love were a transaction and respect was something conditional," she confessed. Evelyn listened attentively, not interrupting, allowing her daughter to release what she had been holding in. When she finally responded, she chose her words carefully. "What matters now isn't erasing the past, but deciding it won't dictate who we are from here on." Clara spoke about the impact the scandal with Daniel was having on the company and how it had forced her to reevaluate her own values. She said she was tired of the culture of blind competitiveness and wanted to turn the workplace into something more human. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn saw a spark of sincerity and humility in her daughter's eyes. It wasn't just an apology, it was the start of real change. The two spent most of the morning discussing possibilities. Clara wanted to renegotiate with Daniel so he would return the money as quickly as possible, and she also considered scaling back the company's projects to focus on what truly had purpose. Evelyn, with her practical experience and calmer perspective, helped outline a plan that balanced justice with feasibility. "There's no point in winning the fight if you lose the business," she cautioned, stressing that decisions needed to be strategic, not driven solely by anger. In the middle of the conversation, Clara asked for something that surprised her mother. "I want you to be more involved, even from a distance. I need your perspective." Evelyn smiled faintly but was firm. "I can help, yes. But my life is in Harborview now. Helping doesn't mean going back to living for you." Clara nodded, understanding that her mother's support would come with clear boundaries and that those boundaries were part of the respect they were rebuilding. That afternoon, they went to the company's office together. Evelyn observed Clara interacting with the team, noticing small changes: of friendlier tone, more attentive listening, a greater willingness to acknowledge mistakes. There was still much to fix, but it was a start. And as Evelyn knew well, beginnings are seeds, they just need care to grow. By the end of the day, sitting together on the couch at home, mother and daughter shared a comfortable silence, something rare until then. "You know, Mom, I think I was afraid of being weak. But now I see that strength isn't shutting yourself off from others, it's having the courage to change," Clara said, squeezing Evelyn's hand. Her mother simply returned the squeeze, feeling that in that gesture there was more truth than in any word. That night, Evelyn went to bed with the sense that, for the first time in years, the bridge between her and Clara wasn't just repaired, it was being rebuilt with stronger materials: respect, empathy, and the conscious choice to look forward. And deep down, she knew this reconciliation didn't mean giving up her independence, but rather creating a new space where love and autonomy could coexist. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change for Clara. The first major decision was to downsize the company. To some, it might have looked like a step backward for her. Now, it was a matter of survival and purpose. Closing overly expensive projects and focusing efforts on what truly brought returns, not just financial, but human, became a priority. Evelyn kept her distance, sending messages with practical advice and words of encouragement, always reminding her daughter that clarity comes when you cut away what is unnecessary. Clara also decided to move. The huge property that had once served as a status symbol was now an unnecessary weight. She chose a smaller, cozier home in a quiet neighborhood, where she could live with more simplicity and less social pressure. The physical change brought emotional impact too. For the first time in years, she felt like the owner of her own space, without having to maintain a facade to impress others. The divorce from Daniel, surprisingly, was amicable, perhaps because he knew that any resistance would only further expose the fraud he had committed. The agreement was settled quickly, with the return of a significant portion of the money and his commitment to stay out of his ex-wife's business for good. Daniel moved to another city, taking with him the shadows that had once loomed over Clara's life. With a leaner company and a reorganized personal life, Clara found room to get involved in social causes. She began by supporting reading programs in underprivileged communities, a choice that did not go unnoticed by Evelyn, who saw in it a reflection of the work she herself did in Harborview. "I guess I learned from the best teacher," Clara wrote in one of her messages, bringing a proud smile to Evelyn's face. These transformations didn't happen without inner resistance. There were days when Clara questioned whether she was on the right path, whether she was giving up too much. But in those moments, she remembered her conversations with Evelyn and the importance of choosing battles that truly matter. She learned that letting go of what drains your energy is actually an act of strength, not weakness. Evelyn, for her part, felt at peace seeing her daughter walk a more balanced road. This wasn't just the recovery of a relationship, it was the blooming of a new chapter for both. Clara was letting go of the narrow, critical view of the past and learning to see her mother as an example of resilience and independence. And Evelyn realized that by keeping her life in Harborview, she was preserving her own freedom while strengthening her bond with her daughter. When they met, their conversations were no longer filled with blame or justifications. There was room to talk about books, plans, and small daily victories. Old hurts still existed, but now they were stored high on a shelf, out of reach of everyday life. And so, they learned that change doesn't mean erasing what has been lived, it means using the past as fertile ground to plant something new. The decision to return to Harborview came naturally, almost quietly, like a tide returning to the shore without fanfare. Evelyn knew her mission there had been fulfilled. Clara was more stable, the company reorganized, her personal life back on track. And although the bond between mother and daughter had been strengthened, Evelyn felt it was time to return to the life she had built for herself. Not because she wanted to distance herself, but because she understood that independence also means knowing when it's time to leave. On the morning of her departure, the two had breakfast together. Clara tried to hide her emotion but ended up saying, "Thank you for everything. I know it wasn't easy to come back after all that happened." Evelyn simply smiled, taking her daughter's hand. Life is full of hard chapters, but it's the way we write the ending that makes all the difference. It was a simple moment, but heavy with meaning, as if they both knew this wasn't a final goodbye, just an interval between meetings. The bus left early, and Evelyn watched through the window as the city faded behind her. She felt a mixture of relief and longing. She thought back to the day she first arrived in Harborview, frightened, with no clear plans, and realized how much she had changed since then. She was no longer the woman who carried the weight of the world's burden and dead weight. Now, she was someone who had rediscovered her worth, had helped her daughter do the same, and knew exactly where she wanted to be. Arriving at the small Harborview bus station, the salty breeze and the cry of seagulls greeted her like old friends. Carrying her suitcase, she walked the cobblestone streets to the bookstore. Henry was behind the counter, stacking books. When he saw her, he broke into a warm smile. "I knew you'd come back." Evelyn replied with a light laugh, "I knew it too, I just didn't know when." Resuming her routine was like placing a bookmark exactly where she had left off. But there was something different now, a sense of completeness. The story corner was busier than ever, and the children ran to hug her when they saw her. Evelyn felt that, beyond keeping the space alive, she was also planting something bigger, a network of affection and learning that grew with each gathering. The days passed, and little by little, life found a new balance. Clara and Evelyn kept in constant contact, exchanging messages and phone calls. In one of these conversations, Clara suggested, "We could start a book club between the two cities, maybe even online?" Evelyn loved the idea. Sharing books and opinions became yet another bridge between mother and daughter, a bridge built not from obligation, but from genuine interest. One evening, sitting on the bookstore's porch with a cup of chamomile tea in her hands, Evelyn looked out at the horizon and thought about how unexpected this journey had been. The initial pain had become fuel for a fresh start she could never have imagined. And while there were still chapters left to write, she knew she was on the right path, one made of independence, reconciliation, and above all, love that had learned how to reinvent itself. Evelyn's journey proves that even the harshest words can become a turning point. She left wounded, but came back stronger, proving that independence, new beginnings, and reconciliation are possible when we decide to write our own story. And you? What's the chapter you need to start today? Don't wait for the world to understand, take the first step now. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep watching. We still have many more narratives to inspire your next chapter.